Okay, well, our numbers are still climbing, but I'm going to go ahead and welcome everyone. We're so glad to be with you. Welcome to Wild Nights Writing the Queer Love Poem, the second evening panel of this year's Tell It Slant Poetry Festival. My name is Brooke Steinhauser. I am the program director at the Emily Dickinson Museum, and I'm delighted to be here with this evening's poets and, of course, with all of you. If you'd like, feel free to go ahead and chime in the chat now and tell us where you're coming from this evening. This week, we're bringing you 20 festival events that celebrate Emily Dickinson's poetic legacy and the contemporary creativity that she and her work continues to inspire from the place she called home. This year's hybrid festival has events happening on site and online, and we are just thrilled to have had festival registrants from over 40 countries. So it's really fun that you're now tuning in the chat to tell us where you're coming from. And I'm seeing it's almost too fast to read. The UK, Canada, Alaska. Hello, Alaska. We have some neighbors from our Massachusetts, California, Colorado. It's just a pleasure to see you all. Tonight's program will be 90 minutes or so and includes readings, conversation, and an audience Q&A. And we want to encourage you to participate in that conversation in two ways. So the first is to ask the panelists a question. You do need to use the Q&A feature, and you're going to type your question in there. That is available to you by a button in your toolbar, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you'd like to offer words of appreciation or thoughtful commentary, please feel free to use the chat function to do that. But the panelists this evening will be using the Q&A feature to address your questions. Before we begin, just note that we have enabled the Zoom auto transcript feature, which transcribes speech to the best of a computer's ability. Do note that this tool is not perfect, and it will likely not translate words spoken in any other language than English tonight. So to toggle this on or off, you may click on the live transcript feature in your toolbar and then click to enable or disable if you prefer not to use it. And now, without further ado, I am pleased to introduce our poets tonight, our poets and panelists, each of whom are going to read an original poem of theirs as we introduce them. So here to kick us off, we have Dan Vera, who lives in Brooklyn neighborhood of DC, and he is co-editor of Imaniman, Poets Writing in the Anzalduin Borderlands, and author of 2 books of poetry, Speaking Weedy Weedy, and The Space Between Our Danger and Delight. He is also author of Emily Dickinson at the Poetry Slam, which was featured in the Poetry Foundation's program Poetry Out Loud. And there are some delightful YouTube videos where you can visit and see high schoolers reading that poem aloud. So Dan, over to you.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to read tonight. I'm reading a short poem from my last book of poetry, Speaking Weedy Weedy. It is a love poem in the guise of a dog poem. It will explain itself. It's titled My Double. I tease you about the dog's affections. You have his eye when you're in the room, and when you walk away, his ears keep pace in case his feet must follow. He wants for you so dearly when you've departed. I tell you, what am I, chop liver? But you are his beef bourguignon. You are the steak tartare of his every dream. I play green with envy, but the truth is, he is my clearest mirror. If I lived in the love time of a dog and thought that every time you left, you might not make it back, wouldn't I climb the chair near the window? Wouldn't I pace the floors in deep distress?
Thank you, Dan. Next up, we'll hear from Malik Thompson. Malik is a Black queer man from DC. He works as a bookstore manager for Black queer-owned Loyalty bookstores in Petworth, DC, and is outgoing co-chair of Outright DC, an annual LGBTQ+ literary festival. Malik, thank you so much for being with us. Love to hear your poem next.
Thank you for hosting, Brooke, and having us. And thank you so much for Kim for organizing this. So I'm going to read a poem entitled August 16th, 2015, that was originally published in Voicemail Poems. This is an edited version of that. So this is August 16th, 2015. We're in this city park, night drenched, my dude's scalp pulsating beneath your finger pads. It's so dark I fail to see the distance, vision obscured with shadows and branches in an undulatory mid-August dance. I believe I can bloom in this fortress quiet, though I hear your heart slam itself against your chest. A one-time thing, only for your birthday, you murmur above a heaving rib cage. And it's this way again, you, aloof, ego enchained, prowling your dungeon's splintered maw. Praise be to the body's honesty, however quickly it may ash. Praise be to our largest star and the selves we entangled around it. Praises to the furtive touches one boy gives another, salvation nearly grasped in his ravenous palms. Thank you.
Thank you, Malik. Next up, we'll hear from Tanya Olson, who lives in Silver Spring and is a lecturer in English at the University of Maryland in Baltimore County. Her book, Boyishly, received a 2014 American Book Award. Woohoo! And her second book is Stay. Thank you, Tanya.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to read a poem from Stay tonight. And I'm going to read this poem really, I guess, for two reasons. One, the book has an epigraph from an Emily Dickinson letter to her friend Emily Fowler Ford, and also has a poem that imagines Emily Dickinson writing a letter to Joseph Cornell in it. But the poem from the book that I'm going to read tonight is a poem that marks today for me. Today is the day that my mother passed away 27 years ago. And so this is a poem that references that. So I'm going to read this poem for my mother tonight. And it's called Amo, Amas, Amat, Amamus. Love is a crazy old thing, and one night you will find yourself on your knees praying, Jesus, please don't let me kill her. If I go to jail, it's going to break my mother's heart. But the truth is, you should be thankful for the opportunity to fall to your knees and pray for the patience not to kill the one you love, because that is one way to know you are in love and alive. For the secret to love is the other person's craziness can't make you crazy. You are never going to find someone who is not crazy. So instead, you need to focus on finding someone who, when everyone else thinks, Lord, I could never live with that, leaves you thinking, don't worry, baby. To me, you're fine, just fine. The art of loving the crazy, I learned from my family like a gift handed down from generation to generation. Take, for instance, people like my grandfather, a farmer who worked in the fields every day, wore the same type of clunky old shoes I do now, and would, at every possible opportunity, insist to you that we never really landed on the moon. It's the desert, he'd say. Look at it. If I can't, anyone could tell if they would just look closely. I can't believe they ever thought we'd all be that easy to fool. But he was wrong. We are. It happens every day. Take, for instance, when my grandfather died, my mother leaned over the casket and kissed him full on the lips, and I thought, I will never love anyone enough to do that, and I may never kiss my mother again. But I was wrong, and I thought about how wrong I was years later when I looked out the window of a plane and watched them load my mother's casket into the hold below. At that moment, all I wanted to do was walk right back out the plane's little umbilical cord, march my clunky shoes up the narrow staircase to where they store all the gas and the food and the luggage, and curl up next to her because I thought it must be cold down there and lonely too, and that is no way to go back home. And it is hard to find someone who understands things like grandfathers believing moon landings were faked, or a person wishing to fly across the country in the frozen, airless womb of a plane so her already dead mother won't be lonely or scared. And even I will admit these things are crazy, crazier in many ways than just kissing the dead. But I also have hope that someday I will find someone who will love me for these things, not despite them. Because love is a crazy old thing, and one night you will find yourself on your knees praying, Jesus, thank you for not letting me kill her. If she weren't around, it would break my heart. And the fact that Jesus or whoever granted you the patience not to kill the one you love probably means that person has been down on their knees asking for the strength to deal with you as well. And that may be one way to know they love you too. For the secret to love is your craziness. It can't make the other person crazy. You are never going to not be crazy. So you need to work on finding someone who, when everyone else says, Lord, that girl is crazy, will put her arm around your shoulder and whisper in your ear, don't worry, baby. To me, you're fine, just fine. Thank you.
Whew, wow, Tanya, thank you for that. Thank you for being here with us on such an important anniversary for you. Next up, we have Saida Agostini. Is a queer Afro-Guyanese poet from Silver Spring whose work explores the ways Black folks harness mythology to enter the fantastic. Her first book is Let the Dead In. Thanks, Saida.
Thanks. Hey, folks. I'm going to start with the poem that I've always been starting with recently. It is called Let the World Be Like My Pussy, and it is from my developing second collection. Let the world be like my pussy. The first time I looked at my pussy was after reading The Color Purple. You remember the part. Miss Seeley takes a mirror, angles it between her own soft black thighs, and gasps at the beguiling wonder of wet purple dusk, blind to the mundane tasks of the day, mister or even shug, and the hazy delights her lips can erupt unbidden. Why labor when your body is built for pleasure? Let the dishes go unwashed, the food stand moldering, fringed with its own new fungal birth. Look at yourself and know what is at the center. I've taken thousands of photos, my fingers a sacred V, cradling the clit and labia, like light she keeps changing. 6 days a month, pussy is a wraith, bitter, bloody, and turning, madder than apples, limbed with its own haunting. Then pussy becomes a centaur, winged, pounding, soft and glorious, charging. She is, in short, impossible, but a revolution, a volta when another pussy is locked against her. I know the world can be like this, curling and attentive, lovelorn and imperious. Angle the mirror closer. Let us know that in any language or form, we are utterly, unerringly beautiful. Let us find the center, a shining galactic aperture, and begin again. Thank you.
Thank you, Saida. I love that poem. And then lastly, we're going to hear from Kim Roberts, who is editor of By Broad Potomac's Shore, selected for Route 1 Reads as the book that best illuminates important aspects of the culture of Washington, D.C. She's the author of 5 books of poems, most recently, The Scientific Method. And I'm going to bring you up, Kim, and over to you.
Thanks so much. So I'm going to read a poem that was inspired by my girlfriend, Tracy, and it happens to be her birthday today. This is a ghazal, which is an ancient form from the Persian, and you'll hear a refrain in each stanza. Ghazal. My girlfriend looks alluring in her madras shorts, splayed out on the sheets in her madras shorts. I don't believe in drawstrings, my girlfriend says. I assure her one exists in her madras shorts. I admire her two-step in old brown slippers, a waggle from the hips in her madras shorts. The city of Madras is now called Chennai, the East India Company's in her madras shorts. Frat boys back from Caribbean resorts love the cheap, strong cotton of her madras shorts. Before the pandemic, we were adults. Now she's in bed at 9 in her madras shorts, in the bright plaid hues woven deft and light, in what passes for pajamas in her madras shorts. All night, her furnace generates terrific heat from the pink pocket hidden in her madras shorts. So this group of us who've all assembled, all of us know each other because we all live in the greater Washington, D.C. area. I wanted to just start with a discussion among the panelists about what they think makes a queer poem different from a queer love poem different from a heterosexual love poem. Is there a difference? Is there a significant difference? Anyone want to start us off?
I mean, I think so much of this to me ties back to kind of like what it has meant to kind of exist in a space where the state has continued to deny our existence, right? And I think particularly looking at the intersections of like gender and sexuality, I think there's been this really beautiful tradition of kind of reveling in our pleasure, regardless, I think, kind of the white cis het gaze, right? You know, I'm thinking about like kind of like kink and BDSM festivals. I'm thinking of like the San Francisco Bears Fest. Is it called the Bears? I'm getting the names mixed up, but you know, the culture of like bears, thinking about the hanky code, right? Like all of those things, I think, have contributed to an invitation for us to really consider, like, how do we practice pleasure in our lives, right? And really recognizing that it's not just about like the pleasure that we feel in our bodies, but recognizing that it's actually an act that is liberatory and helps move us towards like freedom, you know?
Does that mean, Saida, that you think that queer people have developed our own vocabulary?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, it's ever evolving, right? Like I still remember when I went to a PFLAG meeting a few years ago to meet with all like the young people and do research, they were like telling me about like the language that they had evolved and developed, right? And it was such like an incredible thing to kind of think about the fact, like, look where we are now, right? Where we have like this ability to kind of access and develop and continue to build out language to describe our like million odd ways that we exist in this world.
I want to try just to say that, you know, I think it's not about a vocabulary as much as vocabularies, plural, and these ever changing and evolving. I mean, the very act of queerness is about sort of constantly coming out of erasure and having to like, you know, create and recreate one sense of, again, what it is to sort of kind of be fully embodied and fully allowed to love, however that sort of presents itself. And so it feels like it's both steeped in history and also steeped in newness at the same time, because it's constantly trying to find itself. Yeah, just I mean, even from all the American, I mean, I want to sort of kind of liberate it from just the context of this country, but just this idea of how queerness and gender variance has sort of like always existed and always presented itself and found its way to sort of kind of find its voice. And so, yeah, poetry is one of the ways in which that's presented itself.
Yeah, I think that, oh, I'm sorry, Malik, why don't you go ahead?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Are you sure?
Mhm.
I was just gonna agree with Dan that I think that sort of like alwaysness of it is a really important when I think about a queer love poem and what that's kind of grounded in. I think that sort of always that continuation of poems or people or activities that are doing things that you are being told you're not supposed to do, and yet it is the thing that inside right, is the right and good thing to do. So anytime I see that tension, it doesn't necessarily for me have to be like grounded in um, sex or gender or some, but to me poems often feel very queer when they have that up against the thing you're supposed to do and the thing you're not supposed to do.
Huh.
I was going to say that I think one of the key differences that distinguishes queer love poems from like heterosexual or even heteronormative love poems is sort of the attentiveness to the contours of intimacy, right? And like whether that's like sex or desire for emotional closeness or whatever the case may be. I think because queer people, we typically go through a period in our lives, whether that's like up until the teenage years or even like well into adulthood or like later ages like the 40s or 50s. I think having that experience of repressing ourselves and living as someone other than who we are. I mean, like that's more and more that's not becoming a reality for everyone, and that's really good. But I think up until recently, it was not okay to be queer, and having to really sit inside your interior and process your emotions and be your own person creates a particular attentiveness to the multidimensionality of intimacy that you find in like Audre Lorde's poems, right? Where she's like not only, speaking to her desire for these women, particularly the white women she was involved with, but also her rage and her disappointment and her, whatever else was going on with her in these relationships she was having. And I think too, I see this particularly with gay men's writing, like Garth Greenwell, James Baldwin. I mean, they're fiction writers, but they're going through a similar journey as us. As poets, they're trying to work through that prison, that's been pressed onto us. And I think it's important to, like, it's something I try to capture in my poems, is like that process of, working through the sort of monsters and demons that have we've been subjected to and we've internalized, and like how does one break free of that and be honest? Because I don't personally find like I mean there's an audience for it, but like that sort of like fluffy, I'm thinking of Heartstopper. I don't want to shit on Heartstopper, but I'm thinking of Heartstopper, but that sort of like fluffy queer, like it's easy and like everything's, because that's not my experience. And I think that when there's a bit more tortured confession of the like that tortured existence, I find that very compelling for some reason. Maybe I'm just like messed up in the head.
I want to come back to there's so many interesting points that came up, but I want to come back around to this. But first I want to say that we came up with a sort of resource list, which is going to be shared on the website. Some recommended names of recommended queer writers, anthologies, So I think what I'd like to do is have us go around again and have each of us read a queer love poem by another writer who has influenced us. And then we'll try and come back to some of these issues that just came up in this first part of the discussion. So Dan, if you would go first.
Yeah, we're going in, I think, chronological order of the poet being read. And the poet I chose was kind of appropriately for the hosting the festival itself, is Emily Dickinson herself. And I'm reading from a fantastic book, Open Me Carefully, the collected letters, the intimate letters between Emily Dickinson and Susan Huntington Dickinson. And if you are new to that story, Susan Huntington Dickinson was Emily Dickinson's greatest correspondent. She wrote more to Susan Huntington Dickinson than anyone. And over a quarter century, she wrote 276 known poems to Susan. And so I just thought I would read, they're very short poems. I would read 2 of these poems. Dear Sue, it is sweet you are better. I'm greedy to see you. Your note was like the wind. The Bible chooses that, you know, to define the spirit, a wind that rose, though not a leaf in any forest stirred, but with itself did cold engage beyond the realm of bird, a wind that woke, a lone delight, like separation's swell. 195, they're numbered as well. To own a Susan of my own is of itself a bliss. Whatever realm I forfeit, Lord, continue me in this. Emily.
So I'll go next. I wanted to read a poem that I have long loved by Amy Lowell. She's best known for her association with the Imagists, so a sort of early modernist American poet. It's a short poem of hers. This is called The Taxi. When I go away from you, the world beats dead like a slacked drum. I call out for you against the jutted stars and shout into the ridges of the wind. Streets coming fast, one after the other, wedge you away from me. And the lamps of the city prick my eyes so that I can no longer see your face. Why should I leave you to wound myself upon the sharp edges of the night? And I'm trying to remember who was next. Yeah, thank you, Malik.
Cool. So I'm going to read a poem by Reginald Shepard. For those of you who aren't familiar with Reginald Shepard, he was a Black gay man from the Bronx who died of AIDS-related illness. Brilliant poet, beautiful poems, extremely intelligent man who wrote extremely incredible essays on poetry. If you can pick up a copy, Orpheus in the Bronx is like a really, really good book. But I'm going to read his poem, Respite, which I can link to. It's on Poetry Magazine. So let me just drop a little link right now. So everyone, cool. And this is Respite by Reginald Shepard for Robert Fillen. A quick wind weeding the sky. When we step through the glass door, cloud plucked and swept from sight, a full moon sets out repairing the night, putting streetlights in their proper place. The dandelions are foreigners like me, some yellowed, some gone to gray, all stragglers late for sleep. And we have grown deciduous, losing our leaves, letting down our green and palmate in preparations for December. For this and for all year, our naked branched evasions, your fingers warming mine. If the world were an experiment, you would still be waiting.
Thank you. Tanya.
Yeah, so I thought Malik said it so nicely. Pointed out the sort of angst and difficulty that often lies within queerness, and is a great queer art exploration. And as a younger person, one of the things that really helped me with that was seeing artists that were sort of a generation or so ahead of me that, quite frankly, seemed somewhat less angsty than me, and gave me some hope that there was perhaps, a less angsty future ahead. Probably the first two artists that really did that for me were Leslie Feinberg and Minnie Bruce Pratt. And they were so powerful in being people that I could look to, that I knew things were okay. And along with that kind of, the poet I'm gonna read tonight is Ellen Bass, who is a lesbian poet, sort of a generation ahead, that is still continues to write amazing poems, and who I continue to look to as a sort of person to follow along. I'm going to read a poem of hers from her book, Like a Beggar, and the poem is called What Did I Love? Did I love about killing the chickens? Let me start with the drive to the farm as darkness was sinking back into the earth. The road damp and shining like the snail's silver ribbon, and the orchard with its bony branches. I loved the yellow rubber aprons and the way Janet knotted my broken strap, and the stainless steel altars we bleached, Brian sharpening the knives, testing the edge on his thumbnail. All 88 Cornish hens huddled in their crates, wrapping my palms around their white wings, lowering them into the tapered urn. Some seemed unwitting as the world narrowed, some cackled and fluttered, some struggled. I gathered each one, tucked her bright feet, drew her head through the kill cone sharp collar, her keratin beak, and the rumpled red vascular comb that once kept her cool as she pecked in her mansion of grass. I didn't look into those stone eyes. I didn't ask forgiveness. I slid the blade between the feathers and made quick crescent cuts, severing the arteries just under the jaw. Blood like liquor pouring out of the bottle. When I see the nub of heart later, it's hard to believe such a small star could flare like that. I lifted each body, bathing it in heated water until the scaly membrane of the shanks sloughed off under my thumb. And after they were tossed in the large plucking drum, I loved the newly naked birds. Sundering the heads and feet neatly at the joints, a poor man's riches for golden stock. Slitting a fissure, reaching into the chamber, freeing the organs, the spill of intestines, blue-tinged gizzard, the small purses of lungs, the royal hearts, easing the floppy liver carefully from the green gallbladder, its bitter bile, and the fascia unfurling like a transparent fan. When I tugged the esophagus down through the neck, I loved the suck and release as it lets go. Then slicing off the anus with its gray pearl of shit. Over and over, my hands explore each cave, learning to see with my fingertips, like a traveler in a foreign country entering church after church. In every one, the same figures of the Madonna, Christ on the cross, which I'd always thought was gore until Marie said to her it was tender, the most tender image. Every saint and political prisoner, every jailed poet and burning monk. But though I have all the time in the world to think thoughts like this, I don't. I'm empty as I rinse each carcass, and this is what I love most. It's like when the refrigerator turns off and you hear the silence. As the sun rose higher, we shed our sweatshirts and moved the coolers into the shade, but other than that, no time passed. I didn't get hungry. I didn't want to stop. I was breathing from some bright reserve. We twisted each pullet into plastic, iced and loaded them in the cars. I loved the truth. Even in just this one thing, looking straight at the terrible one-sided accord we make with the living of this world. At the end, we scoured the tables, hosed the dried blood, the stain blossoming through the water.
Hey,
Thank you.
folks. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Aida.
Yes. Hey, folks. So I'll be sharing Love Poem Centaur by Donica Kelly. If you don't know about her, get into it. Nothing approaches a field like me. Hard gallop, hard chest, hooves and mane and flicking tail. My love, I apprehend each flower, each winged body, saturated in a light that burnishes. I would make a burnishing of you, by which I mean a field in flower, by which I mean a breaching, my hands making an arrow of themselves, rooting the loosened dirt. I would make for you the barest of sound, wing against wing, there at the point of articulation. Love, I pound the earth for you. I pound the earth.
Thank you all for bringing these other voices into the conversation. One of the things that it occurred to me as we were trying to sort of define a queer love poem is that tension between the very personal and visibility and, sort of making the invisible visible. And I think all of us sort of talked about that in our own ways. So I wanted to sort of go back to that thought about, how we renew the language as a way of finding a place where it's like digging a place where there wasn't one before. Maybe Malik, you can talk a little bit more about that whole tension between private and public.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have a lot to say on that specifically, but I do think that I think there's something really powerful that happens when you have a population of people who are told from, the time that they're able to understand social mores that they should not exist, right? And whether that's overt or covert or purely subliminal or whatever, or, not even like maliciously, it's just that, there's some people in this world who may not have been told that being gay is bad, but just like there was no conversation around it. So I want to make room for that experience. But I think that unleashing of energy that takes place when someone says, I'm going to live my truth, I'm going to live my truth in a creative manner, and I'm going to create imaginative pieces that other people can find themselves in some way, shape, or form. I think that, the relative newness of like the popular imagination, right? Like queer people have always been like creating art for each other, for themselves in a like underground manner. But I think like since the 70s, 60s, since, Stonewall essentially and other sort of like queer liberation actions and movements, like it's a pretty recent thing. And I think that makes sense why we're still having these conversations, while we're still, entering these spaces where we're trying to discover ourselves. Because there's so much work to be done still. And I know like, I don't necessarily want to have a political conversation, but, with things like gay marriage being enacted and the sort of contention around that, and, with the assimilation of certain types of non-hetero peoples into the social fabric of, our society, I think it's interesting to see sort of which voices are now feeling more and more able and feeling urgency to stake a claim for themselves, and who's being rewarded for assimilating. I don't know if that answered your question, but those are the things I think about.
You know, I think for me, like a couple of things come up in this conversation, right? About like, you know, for me, like, why does it feel so important to write this kind of work? Though I will tell y'all, I did have a very friendly lady write me an email after one reading I did. And she was like, I love your work so much, but maybe you should keep some things in the bedroom. You know, and she was very sweet and bought a book, right? But she was like, I just need you to know this is on my spirit, that you don't need to talk about this, right? And I think you know, I would be remiss, right? Like, or any of us would be, like, to not kind of talk about this national moment that we're in, right? Like, where we're seeing incredibly scary and brutal and dehumanizing anti-trans laws across the country. We're seeing don't say gay bills. We're seeing voter suppression. And so oftentimes, like, I think the message that is often being reflected is there's this desire for us not only to go back in the closet, but for us not to exist except within the confines of what is appropriate within white imagination. And so, you know, for me, like, when I think about like, why is it so important to name very loudly clear pleasure in everything that I do, it is because we were never meant to exist, right? And like, particularly thinking about me as like the descendant of enslaved people, the means, sex was a means of production, right? And I think we can all attest to that on some level, right? Like sex is supposed to be a means of production. And so when we talk about pleasure, when we talk about queerness, it pushes against this notion that we're only existing to literally replicate and actually ask ourselves, what does it look like for us to exist in joy?
It makes me think about something Harry Hay wrote about, kind of one of the early gay liberationist writers or activists, but the sense of sort of like, you know, the history of, you know, I'm using the term gender variant, but, you know, variant people like us, constantly arising, that, you know, this idea that, you know, there is something that we contribute, that there's some reason why we keep coming up, you know, that there's this sense of what our contribution is, you know, it's something beyond the binary, beyond, you know, these ordained, either cultural or, you know, this constant repeating refrain, at least during our lifetimes. And, you know, we talk about sort of our liberation, but a sense that, you know, when we say that, we have to sort of recognize that the majority of queer people on this planet do not share the freedom to sort of like live these lives. And we have to remind ourselves of this kind of, to root ourselves in a liberationist understanding of what it means to write and to sort of live openly, and love beyond kind of the normative. And so I think, you know, in the back of my head in this reading around an Emily Dickinson, you know, I think about the idea that, like, you know, we're talking about poetry, that in poetry doesn't exist without queer poetry. It you know, one could argue that American poetry begins with like the two pillars of American poetry being Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman, by some estimates, if you ask most, you know, and you know, in those kind of words, you have two people who had to hide their love poems and letters, or burn them in fireplaces, and, you know, having to sort of like go through ashes to sort of find those open spaces. And so I kind of feel like our poetry sort of is in different ways in that vein of like trying to be part of the larger river of allowing people to sort of live these open and free lives. You know, that's a lot, I know, but but it is a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, to me, it's part of like why that sort of generationalness is really key because, you know, like I feel a part of my family, you know, the family into which I was born. And so generationally, I feel connected to that. And yet also, right, a, a space from that because, you know, I think that's something that queerness makes that space, you know, you're not generationally participating in your family in the same way. And yet I also feel, you know, generationally part of a queer art family, you know, that, and so to me, it is really, I often think about the generation that came before me and how things are different and how things are the same and how things have come back around and, you know, what did they do? And I also feel this obligation for the generations that are coming behind me who do, right, who do, as someone pointed out in the chat, who do now have a different relationship with queerness than someone my age or probably anybody on this panel's age did. And yet it feels important to be putting down things that they will also see as a roadmap in the same way that I saw that roadmap.
Yeah, and as Malik says, it's we have not been visible in the culture for many generations. You know, it's all very old and very new at the same time to American culture. I wanted to, if we could, go around one more time and have everyone read one more of your own queer love poems. I also want to remind everyone who's listening that after we're done with that, we will take some questions from the Q&A. So if you have comments or questions, that's the place to put it, not the chat. And we'll do that next. So I guess we should go in the same order as we originally did. Is that all right? That means Dan, you're up first.
Okay. This poem is titled Miraculous Anniversary. Here we are at 20 years, my trusted hand, my heart and ribbon twin. No words were in my boyhood heart for a promise like you. Living in fear for lack of this, no water, no quench for chapped lips. Whispers were told in farther parts, but I had no ears for such stories. My name was either silence or a curse, written in some earlier illuminated script. Still, the heart speaks in capillary action, swims for a greater stream, you, my current, my rivulet. With no future, nothing but experience, years living with someone else's words, praying to someone else's God, until the day I spied you across a table while you paid attention to later ask me the names of the poets I spoke of as we walked along that strange city's streets. Those were the first hours of our life together, held aloft in each other's caress. Then a year of longing for you across distance until we chanced at whole hours and days and years. The very idea of finding you is pure alien calculus, and yet we did, and I, who hold no belief in heavens or order, must admit to the symmetry of your arm around my shoulder, the way your laughter breaks me open like a clock to its key. In my stifling years of aloneness, I would sometimes repeat the Upanishad that all was emptiness and emptiness is in all. And yet in the barren stone, you rose like a blue flower, the sky seated in earth to rise like a miracle. I will create a chapel to that wonder alone. No religion holds a greater thing than what I know from daily word. You are good and here and mine. I know nothing more to be true than this.
Thank you. Gorgeous. All right, I'm going to read a short poem where every line is used twice and they sort of meet in the middle. It's called Another Lapping Refrain. There's an ocean inside my belly, and you're making my tide rise. I want to apologize to the shore for my past indifference to its beauty. The curl of each wave tip imitates your lips. The moon nestles between your breasts. My belly answers your lapping refrain with my own lapping refrain. Between your breasts, my belly nestles like a moon. The wave tip of your lips is indifferent to its own beauty. I want to apologize to the shore, but you're making my tide rise inside the ocean in my belly. Malik, you're up next.
Cool. Thank you, Kim. Beautiful poem. This poem is entitled Jacob to the Angel. So this is Jacob to the Angel, Genesis 32, verses 22 to 32. Alone, two men, panting in wildland, limbs woven like serpents awakening from winter. Crests of white sand flay red trenches into your back, and somehow we've struggled since nightfall. My forearm torqued deep into your chest, your fallow groin melting into mine. You reach down gently, wrench my hip free of its socket. I seek your blessing at daybreak, beg to be drenched in it, cravings I've undungeoned just this once. And here it is, your hand, my shattered hip, owl song piercing twilight, rivulets of angel seed soaking my bare shoulder. I ask your name, and you, aloof, trunculate, refuse to be known, so I name the land instead.
Tanya, if you would go.
Thank you. I'm going to read a new poem from a new book that I'm working on. And throughout this book, well, it's not the central part of the book. There's a thread of poems that reference the Carter family. And the Carter family were the first family of country music, is how they're often known. They're from Clinch Mountain, Virginia, and they sort of were super talented, but also had the great timing of being one of the first people whose music was put down on records and then could be played on the also booming technology of the radio. And so this is a poem that's about Sarah Carter. The Carter family, the original Carter family, was A.P. Carter, his wife Sarah, and then her cousin Maybelle. And this is a poem about Sarah. And I would say this is not a poem in the homosexual sense of queer, but a queer poem in the sense that Sarah loved who she wanted to love and paid a price for that love. And so this is a poem called What a Poem Do. What a poem do is what anything may do. Make the maker, build a world. While AP went to the valley to catch songs, Sarah fell in love with Coy. Coy of the bluest eyes, Coy what stayed to the mountain, Coy who kept those fields AP was meant to tend. Makers work so hard to make, then walk away from what is made. When the Carter family started to get played on the radio, his mother took Coy to California, got him far away from Sarah. Makers often resent both the making and the made. Sarah knew what her deep alto cost her. Sarah knew what a radio did. Years later on XERA, a Mexican border blaster sitting on the Texas line, Sarah stepped to the mic and sang the most successful song ever wrote. I am thinking tonight of my blue eyes, and I wonder if he ever thinks of me. In California, Coy was listening as he always listened, turned to his mother and said, I reckon I ought to go get her. His mother agreed. I reckon I guess you ought. Same mother what took him from her in the first place. Same mother who hid every letter one sent to the other. Who understands a mother? Who understands her ever-shifting heart? Mothers are makers who kill what they make just to stitch it back together again. Coy drove to Texas that night where he and Sarah married. Sarah left her children on Clinch Mountain. Sarah left music for 30 years until the night she and Maybelle reunited on the Johnny Cash show to sing, "You are my flower that's blooming in the mountain for me. You are my flower that's blooming there for me." An old song no one knows who wrote. No one alive knows who Sarah meant the night she once again sang you in public. And that you is the work, a poem, a song, the work anything made can do. Thank you.
Thanks. Saida?
So this is a poem about a dream I had about Pat Parker. For Pat Parker, for some of you who may or may not know, she was a Black queer woman based in Oakland, California, an activist, a poet, and just a general badass. And of course, I had a dream about her. And once I confirmed with my wife that this was not cheating, I wrote a poem about it. So it's called Pat Parker Visits Me in My Dreams. You are a librarian, precise with soft lips. I walk through the door of your house and become an acolyte without question. We love each other forever. Stay up nights to witness the absolute vast dark of your skin. We smoke cigarettes and drink warm rum, drive hours along the coast, singing Luther, Sylvester, and Prince. Your hands entwined between my legs until I call out for you, and you taste victory on your fingers. I'd like to know you conquered me, like you've conquered the world. I want to know even now you'd love me, this fearless, fearful world you've left so long ago. Would you love me? Would you love what you've made me?
Oh, lovely. So I would like to turn to some of the questions that came up in the Q&A. I want to thank everyone who wrote such lovely, encouraging comments in the chat. It was great to see also at the beginning as people were signing in that we have people from all across the US, Canada, Mexico. I saw Spain and France and even the Philippines in there. So it's just wonderful to have this space for everyone together. So I wanted to actually start with this question that came into the Q&A. Hayden writes, considering how queer rights are influenced and threatened by politics, have you ever been scared to have your queerness openly exposed like that? Question from a young aspiring queer writer, maybe a bit scared. It would be dangerous, but also isn't challenging social rules and morals the goal in a way? Anyone want to take that on?
I can go first. I mean, I feel like having grown up in Washington, D.C., this was the best place to grow up as a Black queer boy. Just because it's still a very queer city, but then when I was coming of age, like I was born in 95, I left the city in 2014. It was a very Black and queer city. And I think for me, it was very easy as a teenager to find spaces that were affirming of my Blackness and my queerness. So I grew up, and also like DC, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Check It, like the gay gang here, and like there's just this ferocity that comes with being Black and queer in DC that I think really challenges the narrative, the normative narrative that like, you know, if you're Black and queer, it's like super difficult. And I mean, there's still difficulty, but I think the community and the environment that I grew up in like was extremely affirming. And so from 17 on, I like walked through the world being like, no one's going to fuck with me because, you know, I'm a Black queer boy from DC. Like they don't come any tougher than this. So I think for me, I was lucky. And I think that it's about finding community. I think the bigger issue is finding community that is affirming of you and will have your back. And having grown up where I grew up, that was very easy to do.
So you're talking about sort of speaking from a point of more of solid ground, of feeling affirmed.
Yeah, I mean, even if the history of DC, so many like Black queer artists are either like from here or spent time here, Essex Hemphill, Marlon Briggs, et cetera, and so forth. So yeah, I feel like location can play a huge factor in how someone orients toward that aspect of queerness.
Maybe in a related question, Kat writes, how have your own queer love poems changed over the decades as queer visibility and politics in this country around queerness have changed? Anyone want to take that one on?
I have to say this, right? Like, I don't know if I've ever had a time in my life where like I just felt completely safe, right? Like I can think of like moments perhaps, like, like I was with my people or whatever, but like I think like when you talk about kind of like experiencing or being constantly confronted with the precarity of your life on a pretty daily basis, and like the media's affirmation of it, right? Whether we're talking about like the killings of unarmed Black folks, or multiple shootings, it's hard. It's really, really hard. I went to the Pulse Memorial in Orlando a few months ago. And it was, I think, right after I read through the leaked release of the repeal of Roe v. Wade, and where they made it really clear, right, that the repeal of not just marriage, but like the criminalizing again of like bodily autonomy was on the chart. Like, I think that resonated for me in a way that I don't know if I necessarily felt before. Because I think before that, I barely remembered when gay marriage was a thing because I was such a new queer, right? Like I was like, what's going on? I'm not getting married, and I think that is reflected in my writing, right? Like, I think I have a lot of rage. I say this while smiling. And also at the same time, right? Like, I think that that kind of rage and deep pain and grief, like, has also forced me to be a lot more precise in the world that I'm trying to build. And I think that kind of precision and rigor, I hope you see in my work. I hope I see in my work.
Yeah, I think thinking about what Saida is saying there, in the new book that I'm working on, a lot of what I'm thinking about is this moment where it seems like so much was going to be possible. Like, I really thought queers were going to fuck up the world. I so thought we were going to do that in the best way. And I thought that that's what was going to happen. That's what we were here for. And then like we got marriage, which is not something that I'm interested in, and the right to be in the military, which is also not something I'm interested in. I'm of the generation, John Waters said, who, when I was queer, it meant that you didn't have to get married and you didn't want to join the military. Like those were your 2 bonus points that you got for being queer. And then somehow those were the things that we won, right? And so it seems like I'm thinking very much about this kind of like, what does it even mean now? Because it didn't happen, right? We didn't fuck up the world. We didn't take the things in a poem I talk about, we were so far outside that we thought like getting in was some kind of victory, but it's not, right? It's not a victory. It's not nothing, because it is true. Like, things are different. My friend Clark says, like, if you ever think that things haven't changed, just remember, he says to me, that you and I spent time as, young people arguing over whether Boy George was gay. Like, that's the world that we lived in. Like, Boy George wasn't out and gay. Like, we were like, maybe he's gay, right? Maybe so. So like, that's crazy, right? That's a crazy world to grow up in. And that's a crazy making world. And we don't exactly live in that world anymore. But neither did we get the things that we could have got or should have got, and what probably we did. And so like, that to me is somebody of like my generation. We have to say to the younger queers, I am sorry, right? We were kicking this door down, and they opened it up, and we thought we won, and we didn't. That was a big mistake. So to me, like, that's the change in, a lot of queer writing and my writing, is that like, it's not about so much like, battering on the door, because they open the door, but it's like, what do you do now that you're inside? And it's the same house, right? You're just in it, and that's maybe not, doesn't mean as much as you thought it was going to.
Well, it also, I mean, it's also true that every advancement is reacted to with a backlash, and we are living in the midst of, and that's true of Reconstruction and the Civil War, and this, the rollback that Saida sort of referred to as, it's a desire for rollback of basically the last 100 years. If you listen to what some of them speak about, not only kind of queer people, but the role of women, and so but. I also think it's always been, I mean, I came out when, and all blessings for her, Urvashi Vad, who we just lost in the last year, but a great liberationist activist who spoke about the idea of contextual freedom, that it's about knowing the context in which we have the liberty, that, we assume that these are safe spaces. When I was in college, it was all about creating safe spaces, and we're there again. We're there again in this, literally from the governorships wanting to do battle against anybody that they can organize a majority to sort of kind of remain in power. But I also think about the pluralities, the safe spaces and the communities that liberate one another. When Malik mentioned Essex Hemphill, as a little queerling, Latino first generation child of immigrants, South Texas, the idea, the language, not having the language for who I am, and also realizing that whatever the mainstream gay reality was didn't somehow speak to me. The writings of Black gay men spoke in a way that was profoundly life affirming, from the sea of cultural vanilla, to use Marlon Riggs's term. So I do think, this is this ongoing struggle. It's this ongoing struggle to sort of like create these spaces and create literature that can be affirming and can be literally life-saving. The works of Pat Parker and Gloria Anzaldúa and so many other queer writers, and queer writers of multiple identities, who constantly kept opening doors, not these larger structural legislative doors, but kept giving permission for people to know that it was okay to be who they were, however they define that. And so we live in perilous times, and some of us have always lived in perilous times and continue to live in perilous times. And it's about what our work can do, what our writing can do. And so, I take some, I don't know, solace isn't the word, but I kind of realize it's that, needing that precision, really, that Saida mentioned, that our work can actually give some hope and sustenance and some direction of what's possible in a world that clearly makes who we are impossible.
I guess related to that, we got one question from Nico. How do you go about finding more queer poets and writers? I've tried to find resources online and virtual connections, but I'm struggling to find a community. I live in the middle of nowhere, Connecticut, so local community doesn't really exist. It's very lonely. I'm wondering if anyone has something hopeful to say to Nico.
There are so many queer poets, all of them, like so many. Like, I mean, I would just say, like, also get linked up with like Lambda Literary, there's tons of like queer virtual events. And what I love is I think often like, and also props to the Emily Dickinson Museum for like still offering hybrid, and given the fact that regardless of what anyone says, we're still in the middle of a pandemic, and there's so many virtual events to take advantage of, but I think definitely following folks like Lambda Literary, and I would even like start following people like on Instagram, like Kay Yolande Barrett, or Dinesh Smith on Twitter, and Jericho Brown. Like those are some of the first people that come to mind just in terms of like hearing more about like queer poets, queer and trans poets.
And the truth is, if you don't, I hear you that it's like you may not be seeing them in your town, in your middle of the nowhere town, and that is 100% true. And I hear that, but there is it can be enough for a while to find them in books and to find them on TV, and to find them on the radio and to find them, on your CDs. You can find people that way long enough until you get to the place where you can sit next to them and see them, and that's it's not the same, right? I hear you. But it can be the steps to get you to the place where you are sitting next to them and talking to them. And that is a different thing, an important thing. So just because they're not there now doesn't mean that they're not ever going to be there. You just got to keep finding the thing that's going to carry you forward a little bit more until you can find them.
Thank you. So Erica writes, what has been your biggest motivation to write, to put your poetry out there? What has made you pursue it or see the power in it? She also asks, has Emily Dickinson inspired you?
I would say Emily Dickinson has definitely inspired me. Just starting there, I really find her sort of elliptical sensibility very inspiring. And I think for me, as like a Black writer, part of what I like often struggle against, like something I saw on Instagram the other day was Honoré Fanon Jeffers saying how like with white fiction writers, it's used like, oh, what do you have to say about craft? Like what sort of intentions do you bring to the line? And with Black writers, it's like, oh, what do you have to say about racism? How do we cure it? What do you think about reparations? I'm moving further and further into the place of like not feeling I need to say those things. And not that I don't care, and not that I don't benefit from people doing that work, but if I'm presenting myself to you as an artist who may obliquely or not sort of reference race, right? Like race is not a prominent aspect of my work. Why the fuck are you asking me about it? Because I have melanin, like it's a weird thing. And again, it's not that I'm very much a leftist, but I think figuring out how to orient toward people as they're trying to present themselves is like increasingly important. But Emily Dickinson, ironically enough, is this like privileged white woman who, you know, lived in Amherst and everything, and like I love her, but is giving me the sort of modality to be quiet and to not say the things people are expecting me to say and sort of orient toward my interior and figure out how to speak from that place. So yeah, big love for Emily Dickinson, and sort of her fingerprints are all up and through American poetry, you know?
Yeah, I think about as a poet who didn't take a very traditional path to poetry. I didn't start writing poetry until I was much older, well out of college, and uh, working and teaching. I didn't take creative writing classes. I don't have an MFA. I didn't follow that very well laid out academic path to, if you want to be a poet, here are the things you do. And to me, I look at Dickinson as, I'm very interested in poets who also don't follow that path. And so to me, Dickinson is somebody who did not follow a very traditional path, and let the poems that she wanted, that she needed to write, drive her, make her path for her. And so to me, she's very important in that way. She didn't write the poems that, people wanted her to write. She wrote the poems that she needed to write and let the people find her. And I think that to me is a very powerful model.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the fact that we're even talking about Emily Dickinson, that there's a museum and a house and a festival, it's just a sheer miracle, you know? I mean, so I think, yeah, I mean, it's just kind of, it's for the guiding thing for her is just the tenacity, to basically write and not, it's not just finding an audience, but finding a future that would find her, which is just utterly remarkable. There is no reason, no logical reason, aside from the quality of her work and her tenacity to create that work, that we're having any of these conversations. No one in the 19th century would have chosen Emily. They wouldn't have known who she was, and they wouldn't have chosen Walt Whitman either. I mean, the other, so, American poetry is birthed out of a miracle, really. I mean, modern, and so to sort of kind of do the work, why do you write poetry, and why do you choose to write? Maybe it's in that lineage of just writing, because one must, but also kind of, looking for reasons for it seems as kind of stupendous as trying to find reasons for like why Dickinson wrote. I mean, that's, it's ultimately the work itself that speaks.
I would also like to add one thing. I would personally argue that, based right off what you said, Dan, that really, when you think about it, Emily Dickinson was like the Kalani, or even Jasmine Sullivan, if you will, of her time, right? Like people who just like didn't get the props that they deserved, right? I know that could also be a controversial statement, not trying to start an argument in the comments. And the other thing that I'll say too, right, is I love that Emily Dickinson is now kind of being acknowledged and claimed, right? Like for her queerness, for the ways in which, like, like that she celebrated love of women, because I think, oftentimes what happens, I have a poem called Harriet Tubman Was a Lesbian, which has been very controversial in some quarters. But, the major reason why I wrote it is because I want my heroes. Like, I deserve them. I deserve to have Black, queer, and trans heroes. And, I think the more of this excavation that we can do, this work of kind of like digging and like naming the queerness of the ancestors that we know and have these relationships with, the better it is for us in terms of being able to know that, like, one, nothing is ever new under the sun, but also two, like we come from this beautiful, beautiful legacy and tradition, right? Like I'm not the first Black queer woman to write about pleasure, and I shouldn't be, but I need to be able to know all of the folks who came before who have been doing this, right? And that just feels really precious and tender.
Oh, it's so beautifully said. Ruben wrote, Emily Dickinson made me believe she trusted her subconscious like a surrealist. I love how her poems bewilder me. I've embraced the idea that they don't always have logic or sense, and I love that. He writes, Lorca wrote about queer love, and so did Emily. I do want to mention, we're getting towards the end of our time here, that all five of us participated recently in a program called DC Pride Poems 2022. I'm going to put a link to that in the chat. If you would like to see 30 short videos of people from Washington, D.C. reading original queer love poems. They're all archived now. They were released one a day during June for National Pride Month. I want to thank again everyone who made this program possible. It is such an honor to work with the Emily Dickinson Museum on this. Thanks particularly to Elizabeth Bradley, who did all of our tech, Brooke Steinhauser, our host for this, and the whole staff. I should mention Anna Plummer also was really instrumental in this, putting this program together. I'm going to hand it back over to Brooke, who is going to talk a little bit about some of the other upcoming events in the festival.
So, oh my gosh, I'm just awash in the glow, I think, of what has been a remarkable evening with you all. Kim and Malik and Tanya and Dan and Saida. I want to thank all of you just on behalf of the Emily Dickinson Museum and the 2022 Tell It Slant Poetry Festival. It has just been a wonderful night with you, and I think we all could have spent another hour and a half listening to your illuminating and brilliant conversation. I'm really left with the impression tonight that you have brought us into such great company tonight with your words and with the way you have brought other poets past and present into the room with us. So, and as one participant wrote in the chat tonight, what a great queer tradition to feel a part of. You really did that for us tonight. So thank you to you poets, and thank you to all of you out there, our participants, for your presence and your wonderful affirming comments and your really insightful questions. It was just a wonderful night. Thank you so much. Another important group I would be remiss if I didn't thank are our sponsors at the Beveridge Family Foundation, People's Bank, and Mass Cultural Council, as well as all of you who have made a donation in support of this free and accessible hybrid festival. We just couldn't do this without you. So thank you. And if you would like to join the ranks of those who supported us, you'll have the opportunity when this Zoom webinar ends, as the donate link will pop right up for you in your browser. And there is so much more festival to come. Tomorrow through Sunday, we are bringing you more poetry programming online and in person. The full schedule and information can be found online on the festival platform Sked. That's also where you'll find, again, the bios and links and handles for these amazing poets, and information about how to buy their books, which we hope you will do. That's also where you can find the extra materials that they have compiled for you, the recommended reading, which I know everyone's going to want to take a look at. So head to Sked if you haven't already. It's not too late to sign up for more programs for the festival, like the Emily Dickinson Poetry Marathon that runs all week. Tomorrow we have a fabulous music and spoken word performance called Trust the Process with poet and musician Tim Hall. And then Saturday night, we have our headliner reading with Tahimba Jess and Sumita Chakraborty, so you don't want to miss that. We're going to pop the link into the chat right now for the festival platform to make sure you've seen the whole schedule. So once again, Kim, Tanya, Dan, Malik, Saida, thank you so much. And I bid you all a good night. We'll see you for more festival events soon. Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Good night. Bye-bye.